Hi guys, how are you today? After a hard-working day, let's relax with this journey through history. If you're as excited as we are to dive into this captivating journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more adventures into the past. Let's uncover the mysteries of the Middle Ages together. Hit that bell icon too, so you're always first in line for the next historical adventure. So settle in, fluff your pillow, maybe light a candle, let's dim the lights and take a deep, relaxing breath. Rome, at the dawn of the 10th century, was a city of deep history and timeless presence. It stood as the center of the Christian world, home to the Papacy, where the spiritual and the temporal intertwined. Its streets, filled with quiet movement, were marked by centuries of change, each layer of time resting lightly upon the other. The city was one of contrasts, ancient ruins standing beside structures of faith, symbols of power blending with remnants of an earlier age. Yet, in the stillness of its quiet mornings, Rome continued its slow, steady rhythm, as it had for centuries before. At the heart of this city was the Papacy, an institution as old as Rome itself. The Pope, seen as the spiritual leader of millions, held a position of reverence and authority. But the role of the Pope extended beyond the purely religious. It was a role shaped by both faith and politics, intertwining sacred duties with earthly responsibilities. Over time, the influence of the Papacy grew, its authority stretching beyond the walls of Rome and into the hearts of nations. Yet, as in all things, the weight of this power was never without consequence. Quiet struggles for influence and control echoed in the chambers of the Vatican, as they had throughout history. In 955, a young man named Octavian, later known as Pope John XII, rose to the papal throne. His ascension, though significant, was not marked by great turmoil or struggle. It was a quiet shift, a subtle turn of events. John XII, at the time of his election, was a figure caught between the old traditions of the papacy and the growing influence of powerful families. His path to the papacy, guided in part by the influence of his family, unfolded like a soft current, pushing him into a position of great responsibility without fanfare. Though his rise would mark a turning point in history, the moment itself was serene, a quiet whisper among the greater tides of time. Power, in its many forms, has always been a part of the city's fabric. Yet power, when woven into the threads of history, is not always loud or sudden. It comes quietly, almost imperceptibly, as it did with John XII. His early years as Pope were not marked by dramatic events, but by a series of small, quiet decisions that in their own way would eventually shape the future. The Church itself, with its enduring influence, did not rush forward. It moved in slow, steady increments. And so it was with the rise of John XII, an event that, while significant, was just one quiet moment in the vast, unfolding tapestry of time. And so, Rome endures. The papacy endures. In the quiet of its streets, its chambers, and its halls, the events that shape the course of history unfold, not in bursts of energy or dramatic clashes, but in soft, steady ripples that travel through time. The rise of John XII was but one of these quiet moments, a small change in a city that continues to bear witness to the slow, unhurried march of history. Rome, a city of quiet transitions. Rome, at the close of the 10th century, was a city deeply rooted in history. Yet, like all places shaped by time, it was also a city in quiet transition. The old stones of the city had stood for centuries, enduring through countless rulers and regimes, each leaving their mark in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The rhythm of life in Rome was not rushed, nor was it marked by the tumult of rapid change. Instead, it moved with a quiet patience, as if the city itself had learned to move slowly, allowing the passage of time to shape it gently, bit by bit. The soft footsteps of the people, the slow pace of carts moving along the cobbled streets, and the distant sound of the bell towers gave a sense of stability. Rome did not hasten. It did not rush toward the future. It existed in a quiet rhythm, ever-changing but always at its own pace, untouched by the urgency of the world beyond its walls. In this slow unfolding, change came quietly, like the turning of a page in an ancient book. The city itself seemed to breathe in time with history. each new day bringing a quiet evolution that would pass unnoticed by most, but slowly, surely, shape the course of events. The role of the papacy. At the heart of this city stood the papacy, a position that, though deeply spiritual in nature, carried with it a power that extended far beyond the realms of faith. The Pope, as the spiritual leader of the Christian world, was regarded with great reverence. Yet his role was not confined merely to matters of the soul, it was intertwined with the political and earthly matters of Rome. The office of the Pope had long been a source of influence, shaping the course of not only the Church but also the broader world. But, as in all things, this power was neither sudden nor dramatic. It grew quietly, steadily, as the currents of history moved, almost without notice, beneath the surface. The nature of the papacy was delicate, not overtly forceful, but deeply entrenched. Those who held the office carried its weight, though often silently. The papacy did not command through force or loud proclamations. It exerted its influence through subtle actions, quiet decisions made in the background. The true power of the Pope was felt not in grand gestures, but in the steady, often unnoticed decisions that shaped the lives of millions. It was a power of great consequence, yet one that unfolded gently, like the waves of an ocean moving ever so slowly, touching distant shores before retreating again. A quiet ascension. In the year 955, a young man named Octavian, later known as Pope John XII, was chosen to occupy the papal throne. His ascension was not the result of any great turmoil or dramatic struggle, but rather the product of a quiet, calculated decision. The forces that guided him into power were not loud or overt. They worked behind closed doors, through alliances and agreements that unfolded gently, like the turning of pages in a well-worn book. His rise was not one marked by public fanfare, but rather by the slow, deliberate machinations of those who sought to shape the course of history, one small, quiet step at a time. Unlike the tumultuous rises to power often depicted in grand stories, the ascent of John XII was quiet, almost imperceptible. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden clash. It was, as many such moments are in history, an event wrapped in subtlety. His name was not shouted from the rooftops, but rather whispered in the halls of those who held the strings of power. The slow gathering of support, the careful consolidation of influence, this was the true nature of his rise. The city moved at its own pace, and so did John XII's ascent. The subtle nature of power. John XII, now Pope, found himself entrusted with a position of immense responsibility, yet one that was not as easily understood as it seemed. The power of the Pope was not always clearly visible. It was not the kind of power that came with dramatic gestures or public displays. It was subtle, woven into the very fabric of the Church and its influence. As with all such power, it was not wielded in the open, but rather in the quiet corridors of decision-making, where choices were made not through loud declarations, but through the careful, patient work of those who knew how to navigate the complexities of influence. In the early days of his papacy, John XII's role seemed to blend into the background of Rome itself. The city continued with its gentle, steady pace, and so too did the papacy. The young Pope's decisions were often made in silence, the ripples of his actions spreading quietly throughout the Church and the world beyond. His influence, while immense, was often subtle, gently shaping the events that unfolded over time. It was a quiet, reflective power, one that was neither rushed nor easily noticed, but whose effects would be felt over the course of many years. Rome's quiet pulse. As time moved on, John XII's reign unfolded much like the city around him, quietly, steadily, without the need for dramatic shifts. His actions, though significant, were often made behind the scenes, in the calm and measured manner that characterized so much of the political and religious life of Rome. The rise to power was not an event that could be pinpointed with precision. It was a slow unfolding, a steady process that carried with it the weight of centuries of tradition, of alliances formed and broken in the shadows, of decisions made without the noise of public awareness. And in this quiet unfolding, John XII became yet another figure in the long, steady march of history. Rome, in its quiet patience, was a fitting backdrop to this steady progress. The city, like its leaders, moved without rush, each moment carrying the next in a slow, deliberate flow of time. As the years passed, John the XII's decisions took root, subtly shaping the path ahead, though often unnoticed at the time. His reign was not defined by large, sweeping events, but by the quiet, continual action of those in power who moved slowly, with purpose, through the chambers of the church. Reflections on the nature of power. Power, like time, moves with a quiet and steady force. It is not always visible, but it is always present, shaping the course of events in ways that are often subtle, sometimes imperceptible. John the XII, in his quiet rise to power, became a part of this ongoing flow of history. Neither the cause of great upheaval nor the bearer of grand change, but a figure who, through small, patient decisions, left his mark upon the city of Rome and the wider world. His story, like that of Rome itself, was one of slow, steady progression, where each step, though gentle, moved inexorably forward. The scandalous affairs of John the XII, the quiet nature of the affairs. In the unfolding story of John the XII, there exists a quiet tension, an almost imperceptible shift in the course of his reign. The affairs, which would come to define much of his time as Pope, were not marked by overt displays or loud confrontations. Rather, they were whispered occurrences, taking place in the shadows of power, hidden from the public eye. These affairs, while significant in their own way, did not burst into the open with fanfare. Instead, they crept through the quiet spaces of Rome, carried out in secrecy, far from the gaze of the masses. Rome in those years was a city of layers, each one hiding the other. Beneath the grandeur of its buildings, behind the solemnity of its institutions, there existed a world of personal desires and hidden lives. John the XII, like many others who held power, was not immune to the quiet forces of temptation. His position, though one of sacred duty, was also one of great influence, an influence that attracted the attention of those eager to participate in the privileges of power. The influence of Rome's aristocracy. Rome was a city of wealth, not only in material terms, but in the influence of its aristocracy. The nobility of Rome, with their deep ties to the Church, had long been able to influence the affairs of the papacy. John the XII, as a young man, was drawn into this web of influence. His relationships with the noble women of Rome, like the political alliances formed in those quiet rooms, went largely unnoticed by the public, but were known among those who held power in the city. The aristocracy of Rome had their own interests, and these often aligned with the papacy. The women of the noble families, whose names were whispered among the elite, were not merely figures of romantic interest, but instruments of influence, just as their male counterparts were. The relationships John the XII formed were not only born of desire, but also out of the subtle dance of power and ambition. These connections, though often unseen, were woven into the very fabric of Roman society, quietly sustaining the balance of influence that existed between the church and the city's nobility. Yet these affairs were not born of malice, nor did they carry with them the kind of dramatic consequences often associated with scandals. They were rather the quiet occurrences of a young man in power, discovering the ways in which influence can be shaped in both personal and political matters. John the XII's actions, while not public, were a reflection of the world around him, a world where personal and political lines were often blurred, and where even the most sacred of positions could be subtly affected by the desires of those who held power. The hidden lives of the clergy. The affairs of John the XII, while known to a select few, remained mostly concealed within the confines of the papal court. The clergy, though dedicated to their vows, were not strangers to the complexities of human nature. Within the walls of the Vatican, behind the solemnity of rituals and prayers, there existed a quiet tension. John the XII, as Pope, was not free from the human instincts that guided the actions of others. In his case, these instincts often led him into relationships that, though personal, reflected the broader patterns of power and temptation that ran through the veins of the Church. There were no loud outcries from the clergy, no public denouncement of the young Pope's actions. Instead, there were quiet murmurs, the slow shaking of heads behind closed doors. In the quiet halls of the Vatican, where time moved in slow rhythms, the affairs of John the XII were hardly discussed aloud. The men who lived within the walls of the church were not immune to the same desires and weaknesses as those outside, and John XII's actions, while discreet, mirrored the complexities of the world in which he ruled. These personal affairs, though significant in their own way, were not the cause of great scandal or upheaval. They were not dramatic in their consequences, but were instead woven into the quiet tapestry of life within the Vatican. They became, over time, part of the larger story of a pope whose power was both sacred and secular. In the stillness of the Church, where decisions were made with quiet deliberation, John XII's personal life remained a shadow, existing beneath the surface of his public role. The gradual erosion of trust. As time passed, the whispers of John XII's affairs grew more frequent, but they did not shake the foundations of his reign. The public did not cry out in outrage, nor did the nobles rise up in rebellion. The affairs, though known, did not bring about immediate consequences. Instead, they settled into the background of his papacy, much like the slow erosion of a riverbank that, though imperceptible day by day, eventually changes the landscape. The power of the Pope, like the city of Rome itself, was not so easily undone by the quiet actions of one man. John XII's reputation, though damaged in some circles, did not immediately affect his position. The papacy, with its enduring power, moved on, as it always had. His actions, while not forgotten, were soon overshadowed by the ongoing rhythm of the Church and the city. The people, for the most part, did not see the quiet dissolution of trust, nor did they feel the subtle shift in the balance of power. In Rome, things moved at their own pace, and so it was with John XII's reign. The affairs were part of the quiet story of his papacy, not the defining event, but a thread in the long, slow weave of history. The nature of John XII's affairs, though less dramatic than the scandals that might define the reigns of other leaders, speaks to the larger, quieter truths of power and human nature. His actions, while not overtly destructive, were part of the soft, unspoken erosion of trust that accompanies any misuse of influence. Over time, these small, hidden actions built upon one another, and the quiet decay of trust spread, unnoticed at first, through the hearts of those around him. In the end, it was not the loud and dramatic collapse of power, but the subtle fading of it that marked the true consequence of his personal choices. A quiet, lingering legacy. The story of John XII's affairs, though hardly spoken of in the loudest terms, lingers in the quiet corners of history. It is not a tale of great scandal or sudden disgrace, but one of slow, quiet consequences. The whispers, the unspoken understandings, and the delicate dance of power all shaped the final outcome of his reign. In the end, the affairs of John XII were not the cause of his downfall, but they were part of a larger pattern, a pattern of subtle shifts, small missteps, and quiet betrayals that over time eroded the foundation of trust upon which his papacy rested. And so, as with all things in Rome, the legacy of John XII's actions became part of the city's slow-moving history, neither dramatic nor easily visible, but present nonetheless. His story, though not defined by great scandal, was marked by the quiet erosion of faith, a reminder that power, in its quietest forms, can be just as vulnerable as it is in its loudest displays. Corruption and power. The quiet web of influence. The papacy, as with all positions of power, had its own quiet rhythms. It was not always marked by loud declarations or sudden sweeping changes. Rather, it was the subtle weaving of influence, quiet decisions made behind the walls of the Vatican, soft murmurs exchanged in rooms that would never be seen by the public. John XII, though a figure of great spiritual importance, was not immune to the forces that shape the lives of those in power. As his reign continued, the web of influence around him grew tighter, and the quiet acts of manipulation and calculation became more pronounced. Power, like time, is often not immediate. It moves slowly, settling into the hands of those who know how to navigate its currents. John XII, though young and still learning the weight of his office, soon found himself surrounded by those who understood the quiet dance of control. The decisions he made, though not always visible, began to affect the very fabric of the Church. What was once a position of sacred duty began to take on more earthly implications. He became increasingly aware of the subtle nature of power, the ability to make decisions not through force, but through the quiet shaping of circumstances. The gradual shift of priorities. As time moved forward, John XII's decisions reflected a gradual shift in his priorities. What began as an office rooted in spiritual guidance began to drift toward the desires of personal power. He did not act impulsively, nor did he openly flaunt his influence. Instead, the changes were slow, almost imperceptible, like the quiet erosion of a riverbank that slowly gives way to the water. The Church, once the beacon of moral guidance, now found itself entangled in the quieter dealings of a world driven by ambition and desire. The men around John XII, those who helped guide his early decisions, also knew how to navigate the subtleties of power. Together, they created a quiet system, one that moved with little disruption, but one that, over time, would alter the direction of the papacy. The accumulation of wealth, the buying of positions within the Church, and the manipulation of the faithful were not overt acts of rebellion or open corruption. They were instead the soft, steady compromises made in the quiet corridors of power, where the lines between spiritual duty and earthly gain blurred ever so slightly. The subtle nature of corruption. Corruption, in its gentlest form, is not always loud. It does not announce itself in dramatic bursts or through sudden acts of betrayal. Instead, it grows quietly, often unnoticed by those it affects most. In the case of John XII, the corruption that crept into his papacy was not one of blatant theft or violent betrayal. Rather, it was a quiet manipulation of the system, a shifting of priorities that slowly blurred the lines between sacred duty and earthly desires. These actions, though significant, were often veiled by the apparent normalcy of daily life. The buying and selling of positions within the Church, the manipulation of the faithful, the quiet decisions made behind closed doors. These were not the actions of a man who sought to make a dramatic statement. They were the actions of someone who, over time, had come to believe that power could be wielded quietly, subtly, without the need for grand gestures. And in this quiet accumulation of influence, the very essence of the papacy began to change. The sacred office, once the symbol of moral clarity, became, over time, a tool to secure personal ambition, the quiet nature of power's downfall. And yet, power, like time, is not always a force that can be controlled forever. In the quiet erosion of trust, in the slow, steady compromise of principles, the foundation of a reign begins to weaken. The corruption, though subtle at first, eventually builds upon itself. What was once a minor decision, a small deviation from the path of virtue, slowly becomes a pattern. As the years passed, John XII's papacy began to reflect this quiet degradation. What had once been a sacred responsibility became a place where personal ambition quietly took root, influencing not only the Church, but the broader world around it. The consequences of these actions were not immediate. They did not appear suddenly, nor did they arrive with loud protests or open rebellion. Instead, they crept into the heart of the papacy, undermining it slowly, quietly. As trust in John XII's leadership began to erode, so too did the foundation upon which the power of the Pope stood. The downfall was not one of explosive drama, but one of gradual and quiet decay, a slow movement of the tide that gradually shifted the course of history. The consequences and downfall, the erosion of support. As the years passed, the effects of John XII's actions began to manifest. But these effects did not arrive in the form of loud protests or dramatic outcries. Instead, they came in the form of subtle shifts. Those who once supported him began to question his leadership, not with open rebellion, but with quiet dissatisfaction. The once strong alliances that had secured his papacy began to fray, weakened by the growing sense of betrayal, however muted. Those around him, who had once looked to him for guidance, now found themselves questioning his integrity, not in public, but in whispered conversations held behind closed doors. The erosion of support was gradual, but it was undeniable. The foundation of trust upon which John XII's authority was built slowly began to crumble. The papacy, once seen as a beacon of moral leadership, began to lose its shine. The slow unraveling of his position was not met with loud calls for action, but with quiet discontent. The people and clergy of Rome, who once looked to him for spiritual and political guidance, now found themselves drifting away, unsure of the man who had once been their pope. A quiet fall. In the end, the downfall of John XII was not marked by great public confrontation. There were no fiery speeches or grand displays. Instead, it came quietly, like the fading of a shadow at dusk. The very nature of his power, once so firmly rooted in the trust and respect of those around him, now seemed distant, fragile. The trust he had once enjoyed had been quietly worn away, and in its place was a growing sense of disillusionment. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift, but one that ultimately spelled the end of his reign. His fall was not sudden or dramatic, but a gradual slipping away from the seat of power. The very forces that had once elevated him now turned their backs, not in open rebellion, but in silent withdrawal. It was a fall that occurred not in a single moment, but over the slow passing of time, as the quiet erosion of his authority and the growing disillusionment of those around him led to his eventual loss of control. The quiet reflection on his legacy. As the years went by, John XII's papacy became a quiet lesson in the nature of power. It was not the loud actions that defined his reign, but the small, subtle shifts that, over time, led to his fall. His legacy, though marked by the quietness of his own decisions, became a cautionary tale. The consequences of his actions were not immediate, nor were they accompanied by dramatic events. Instead, they unfolded slowly, like a story told in whispers, each word adding to the inevitable conclusion. The downfall of John XII, like his rise to power, was not marked by great drama. It was a quiet fading, a gentle retreat from a position that had once seemed so secure, and as time moved on, his story became a part of the slow, unfolding tapestry of history, not defined by explosive moments, but by the subtle consequences of choices made in the quiet shadows of power. In the end, the story of John XII, like many others before him, was not one of grand battles or open confrontations, but of slow, quiet movements that led to his downfall. Power, though it may appear steadfast and unyielding, is always subject to the quiet forces of time, influence, and the gradual erosion of trust. The papacy, once solid and strong, was shaken not by open rebellion, but by the slow, subtle changes that came from within. His story is a quiet reminder that power, in all its forms, is fragile and can slip away not with a loud crash, but with a soft, steady drift into silence. A quiet end. As the story of Pope John XII comes to a close, we find ourselves not at the climax of a grand tale, but at the quiet reflection on what has passed. The ebb and flow of history, like the steady movement of a river, has carried us through the rise, the choices, and the eventual fall of this particular figure. There was no grand finale, no dramatic outburst. Instead, there was only the gradual fading of influence, the slow unwinding of what had once seemed so firm and unyielding. The consequences of his actions, though significant, were not swift in their arrival. They came with the quiet persistence of time, unannounced and steady. The fall of John XII was not marked by the loud, definitive moments that often accompany the end of a reign. Instead, it unfolded softly, like the fading of light at dusk. It was a process that took place over many years, where the smallest actions, the quiet decisions, led to an eventual conclusion. In the end, his legacy was not shaped by any one event, but by the steady, unchanging flow of time and the silent consequences of his choices. The subtle nature of influence. In reflecting on the life of John XII, it is not the grand acts of rebellion or public disgrace that come to mind. Instead, it is the subtle influence of his choices, the quiet shift in the balance of power that quietly took hold. The influence of one's actions is not always immediate, nor is it always loud. It is often the smallest of decisions, made behind closed doors, that gradually begin to alter the course of events. Such was the case with John XII. His rise to power, though seemingly ordinary, was shaped by these same quiet forces. The decisions he made, though not immediately visible, set in motion a series of events that would eventually bring him down. His legacy, though marked by moments of influence, is ultimately one of quiet reflection. It is a reminder that power, when not carefully tended, can easily slip away, not in a dramatic fall, but in the gentle, almost imperceptible, fading of support. The quiet erosion of trust. One of the most important lessons in the story of John the Boy 12 is the subtle erosion of trust that took place. Trust, once broken, does not return quickly. It is a fragile thing, and when it is undermined, the damage is often slow to reveal itself. John the XII's power, once so firmly rooted in the trust of those around him, began to dissolve, not in an instant, but over time. As small choices accumulated, as the quiet whispers of discontent grew louder, his position weakened. This erosion was not marked by grand confrontations, but by the slow, steady withdrawal of support. Those who once trusted him quietly distanced themselves. The erosion of trust did not happen suddenly, but rather in a gentle, continuous way. It is a reminder that the foundation of any strong leadership is trust, and when that trust is compromised, the weight of responsibility becomes harder to bear. Like the gradual wearing away of stone by water, trust, once eroded, can be difficult to rebuild. Lessons in the passing of time. Looking back at the reign of John the XII, we are reminded of the slow, measured nature of time and the way it shapes all things. History moves forward not in bursts of excitement, but in quiet steps, each moment passing into the next. John the XII's story is but a small chapter in the grand narrative of the Church, yet it carries within it a timeless lesson. Power, when misused or neglected, will slowly fade. Trust, once lost, takes time to rebuild, and even the most seemingly stable institutions are subject to the steady march of time. In the quiet reflection on John XII's life, we are left with the realization that history, in its vast expanse, unfolds gently, like the passing of seasons. The lessons we learn are often not from grand events, but from the small, quiet moments that go unnoticed at the time. As with all things in life, the most lasting changes come not from sudden upheavals, but from the slow, steady accumulation of choices made over time. Thank you for joining us. Rest well, take care of your beautiful self, whatever that means to you, and until next time, good night.